Morning. Tectonic shifts are occurring within the Middle East. Iranian-backed Hezbollah had been considered the most powerful non-state group in the region, yet Israel, since the pager episode of September 2024, has considerably weakened it and eliminated most of its command structure. Yet, with the ceasefire about to expire in Lebanon, threats are coming from Naim Qassam, Hezbollah's current commander, who recently said, quote, "Our patience may run out before the end of a 60-day ceasefire." Memory has also put out a piece saying that two Lebanese groups are circulating flyers for youth to join them and Hezbollah to, quote, "fight the armed resistance in southern Lebanon." The IDF claims to have eliminated 80% of the Hamas infrastructure in Gaza, yet the Hamas terrorist infrastructure remains, and Yoni Ben Menachem of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs put out a piece this week saying Hamas has just recruited 4,000 new fighters in exchange for money, humanitarian aid, and medical treatment. Every single day, it seems that another IDF soldier is wounded or killed in Gaza. As I write this, 3 more soldiers were killed this week, bringing the toll to approximately 328 just in Gaza. Hamas has been considerably influenced by funds flowing in from Turkey, from Qatar, and from Iran. With the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, the land bridge from Tehran to Beirut is definitely gone. Yet Israel now is facing new challenges with Mohammad al-Jolani of Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, who has his roots in the radical Sunni group Jabhat al-Nusra, a spin-off of al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Israelis now have a policy towards him of, quote, "respect but suspect." At this moment, Turkey is threatening military action against a group that's shown tremendous loyalty to the United States, the Kurds in Syria. We'll wait and see what happens on that front. And since 2023, the Houthis have attacked shipping lanes in the Red Sea against the U.S. and other vessels and have fired suicide drones and missiles at Israel on an almost daily basis, having many Israelis fleeing into their sealed rooms and shelters. While Israel has made a great deal of progress, tremendous challenges remain. Yes, Tehran has been seriously weakened, but Ankara is a rising threat. And we see from the IAEA's most recent report of August 29, 2024, that Iran is continuing to enrich uranium and has enough for 4 nuclear bombs as it continues to turn away the IAEA inspectors. While on its last legs, Iran might feel threatened enough to lurch towards a nuclear attack. All of this comes as a backdrop to introducing the brilliant David Wurmser. David is a Middle East analyst from the Center for Security Policy here in Washington and the Misgov Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy in Jerusalem. David has been a key advisor to both Vice President Dick Cheney and to National Security Advisor John Bolton. And he recently wrote a masterful column in JNS, in which he opens with the words, quote, the desolation, brought on Hezbollah by Israel and the humiliation inflicted on Iran has not only left the Iranian axis exposed to Israeli power and further withering, it has altered the strategic tectonics of the Middle East. The story is not just Iran anymore. The region is showing the first signs of tremendous geopolitical change, and the pieces on the board are beginning to move. So, David, first of all, just explain the movement of the tectonic pieces. Who are now the regional power players?
All right. Well, first of all, yeah, starting from that very quote that you and the Iranian axis of evil as still in existence. I mean, it is wounded, it is declining. It has left a vacuum in Syria and elsewhere. But a wounded cobra, you don't turn your back on a wounded cobra. So the first thing is to make absolutely clear that as we look into the future and Israel prepares for the future and strategically organizes itself for the future, an action which has to start now, it has to first finish the job of the past. And the job of the, I mean, to give a good example or analogy, it's at the end of World War II, it was very clear by February, after the Battle of the Bulge, which was the last major setback for the Allies in World War II. It was a straight shot, and it was clear after the Battle of the Bulge. It was a straight shot to the collapse of the Nazi German structure, and it was also increasingly clear to many people that Russia was emerging as the next threat, the next power, and that the United States had to start organizing for it. And there were some voices that called for having a ceasefire with the Nazis, and there were Nazis who entertained the idea of signing a ceasefire with the United States and Britain. I think it was Himmler. Yes, Himmler himself was one of them. And by the way, just as an aside, so we get into tangents on tangents, the agent, and this is a whole different story, but the agent he sent to negotiate that ceasefire, and I use the word agent very deliberately, was the head of the Red Cross, Count Bernadotte. We can get into that in question and answer why I use that word, but and why I'm not just throwing it out. But at any rate, the point I'm trying to make here is you had to finish the Nazis off before you could strategically organize to deal with the Soviets, and because you couldn't have a rump Nazi Germany. You couldn't reintegrate Germany into the Western alliance structure. You couldn't move forward until you finished the past. And that's where we are with Iran right now. Iran is extremely dangerous. Iran still has assets. Iran can still come back. Iran can still it can cross the nuclear threshold and destroy Israel with a nuclear weapon. So the cobra lives, the cobra is venomous, and the cobra still has enough energy to strike. One cannot turn one's back on it. The cobra has to be slain first, and then we can deal with the tectonics of the region as they shift.
So we saw yesterday how Iran had military maneuvers around the Natanz military facility or nuclear facility. And, we did see April 13th, when Israel struck back in October 1st again. How weakened do you think the nuclear facilities are in Iran?
I think they're weakened, and I think the Israelis have access, but it's a perishable advantage. It's perishable on two levels. One is the Iranians advance further, and as they advance further, the bottlenecks shift places. Number one. Number two, the intelligence can go bad. Three, most importantly, they cross certain thresholds that can't be reversed. So there's a real fast ticking stopwatch on that. And the second thing is, the enemy, the Iranians didn't turn around and say, you won. Wow, you did. Kudos to Jerusalem. We're going to just, we'll just live with that. They're spending every minute of every day to find workarounds. So again, the advantage Israel gained slowly erodes over time and is perishable. Do the Russians, does China, do Iran have the answers to Israel's air power at this point? We don't know for sure, probably not yet, but you can bet that they're spending every morning, evening, and afternoon thinking about that, probably night too. So this is perishable on many different levels. And the nuclear issue is the key one for the Iranian government right now. A government like that, which is essentially a totalitarian ideology, knows first, there is no moderation. There is no Khomeini with human face. It's an on-off switch, like a normal country, so to speak, which can live within its britches. It reaches that point where its monopoly on power is the problem for the people in reform. And then it has to make a choice. Does it continue to reform and collapse because its monopoly on power has to be given up? Or does it retrench into a Stalinist response, which has to be externalized with aggressiveness externally? And that's where Iran is right now. It is a government that relies on omnipotence, the image of omnipotence, self-confidence, and brutality. And all of a sudden, its omnipotence has turned to impotence because of the IDF and IAF, the Israeli Army and Israeli Air Force. Its self-confidence is obviously shattered because of that. And third, its brutality is still there, but it hasn't the ability to maintain its empire through brutality. That's been destroyed. So it is at the verge of collapsing, and it needs something to reverse that, and that's the nuclear program. That will establish potence again, and it won't fully reverse the impotence, but it will add something to it. And it won't make it omnipotence, but it'll certainly make it a powerful country. It shows that it's not giving up and it's confident and still finding answers. And its brutality, the brutality that it can threaten through a nuclear program, is so extensive that it tells its own people, we're not done yet. And so the nuclear program is the game now for Iran. And that's why your question, I think, was so relevant.
So in 2024, Iran executed more people than any other year. So it's a brutality domestically and internationally. How likely do you think Tehran might be, while it's on its last legs, to strike out with a nuclear weapon against Israel?
I think it's highly likely. It's highly likely, first of all, because it's its only path possibly for survival. We think of it as suicidal. They really don't care if they lose half their population. They have said so. That's not me analyzing them. That is they themselves saying that at times. Two, it's in their ideology of the Great War, the Gog and Magog, essentially, that we have, or the Antichrist versus Christ among Christians. They have the equivalent end of days war. And the IRGC, while the old line clerics believe the preservation of the regime is paramount and a certain caution is in order, not moderation, caution. Caution that uses manipulation, but they're not moderate, believe me. But they want a path of regime survival. But you have a whole crowd which is anchored to the IRGC that believes in pushing forward some sort of an apocalypse that will show faith, that then brings about the Great War, that then brings the great final victory. So we're not dealing with people who necessarily fit into our deterrent regime. More and more of them. I mean, Soleimani, there's a great story from when a few years ago, Soleimani essentially believed that only by showing boldness against America and destructive capability against it in Israel do you establish the faith that allows your regime to survive. So he believed in regime survival too, but his terms of reference and the crowd surrounding Khamenei is that crowd. It's Saeed Jalili, who was the national security advisor in the past. It's this Ismail Khani and so forth. They're all this crowd. So the idea that we can deter them, I don't believe that's realistic at this point.
So when you're talking about Gog Magog, that huge conflict, it seems to be playing out within Syria right now. Could you describe Ankara's rise and Tehran's fall and what is happening internally within Syria?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are sort of a little smitten by this Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, the HTS, which has taken over Syria, and Ahmed Ashara, who goes by, I guess, Mohammad al-Jolani right now. that they rebel strategy that succeeded. The problem with that is that it really wasn't they who won, it was Israel. The core of the Syrian regime had deteriorated under the Arab Spring and in 2011 in the civil war that ensued. The core of the regime was no longer able to protect itself. On one side, it needed Russian air power. That's the core. A few mercenary forces, although mercenary forces didn't always do so well in Syria for Russia, and their Russian control of one or two of the divisions of Syria's army. But more than that, it relied on the IRGC and Hezbollah. They were the real workhorses of repression and combat over the last decade in Syria, or decade and a half from Syria. So when Israel destroyed the IRGC in Syria, and they did, and they destroyed the combat capabilities of Hezbollah in Syria, which they did also, the Syrian regime was essentially undefended. And it was just like a small summer breeze on a huge rotten oak tree, the smallest summering it down, and it happened. It was really an Israeli victory in Syria. The problem is the Israelis they're not set up to deal with the consequences of that entirely yet. They will be, but not yet. But Russia and Iran suffered a major blow. We hear all this stuff about Russia decided to give up, and I think that there just weren't the assets there to fight anymore.
Right.
So,
so can you
now about, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
yeah. So about Jolani himself, first of all, one has to remember Syria is 40% Sunni Arab. That is al-Jolani's people. There are Kurds, there are Druze, there are Alawites, there are Christians, there are Yazidis. So the idea that this is a Sunni Arab country has great currency and great anchoring, but it is not the reality of the population right now. The population right now is majority not Sunni Arab. Now, why is that significant? So it's obvious the Turks were behind HTS and ISIS. Their forces, they're flooding Syria now with Turkic Islamists from all over, whether it's Uyghurs, whether it's from Kazakhstan, wherever. There's a huge Turkish infusion of Islamists. But Turkey has also triggered something very dangerous, because Damascus is not just, while I said it's only 40% Sunni Arab, Damascus is the most important city for Sunni Arab nationalism. Why? Because, and especially for Islamist Sunni Arab nationalists. Why? Because it is the seat of the Umayyad Empire. Now, why is that important? Mohammad dies. There are two caliphs immediately after. The third one is from the Umayyad family. When he dies, he's replaced by Ali. Ali wants to clean things up. He doesn't like the corruption and lack of true Islamic faith of the Umayyad world that was created. So he cracks down, and the Umayyad and the cousin of the caliph in Damascus decides he won't have any of this. He's too corrupt and so forth. So he launches a coup and he wins. And that's essential. And Ali goes off, and that's the beginning of the Sunni Shiite split, essentially. But most importantly, for our purposes here, it is the beginning of the true Sunni Arab national or Sunni Arab imperial project, the Umayyad. And when you hear Salafis, those people who believe in the purity of the first 100 or so years of Islam, and if Islam can only return to that first pure 100 years of faith, it will resume its imperial expansion and take over the world and convert everybody or kill those who don't. If you look at that first 100 years, that's the Umayyad Empire. And then it was believed that when the Abbasids took over 100 and some years afterwards and moved it to Baghdad, that was the beginning of the corruption of Islam that led to the stalling and decline of Islam. So for them, this Umayyad Empire is the symbolic heart of the resurgence of Islam and its success globally from a Salafi, from an Islamist purist uh, objective. In that sense, Damascus is even more important than Mecca for them, because this is the symbol, this is the core, this is the heart of the image of Sunni Arab power. And of course, the second thing that was very important to that, and this is for Israel to realize, is that the Umayyads took a long time to conquer Mecca. There was a huge civil war under Ibn Zubair that took almost 60 years in various iterations, almost 60 years before it was conquered. So the Umayyads focused on Jerusalem instead, because by essentially asserting dominance over the Christians in Jerusalem and putting some sort of a memorial on the Jewish temple to show dominance over the Jews, they essentially, even without having Mecca in their control. So the order of importance really is Damascus and then Mecca, but until you get to Mecca, you first conquer Jerusalem. Now, is Jolani like this? Well, first of all, one has to understand Islamism is again another one of these totalitarian ideologies. And totalitarianism has an on-off switch. We know, and Sarah, your organization has worked with Islamists who have really decided that's not the right path. And you know what it looks like. It's like former communists. They become the biggest anti-communists. They know who they're dealing with. Just like, when we deal with Musab, Yusuf and so forth, we know the Green Prince. We know what it looks like because it's an on-off switch. If they really turned against Islamism or they want to moderate it, they go all the way and reject it altogether. Jolani is laying one over on us. There is no Islamism with a human face. There is no Islamism third way. Just like there was never a communism third way. Dubček, the Czechs in '68 found that out painfully. It's an either or. So we're facing that now in Syria. We're facing the symbolic importance of having taken Damascus. So why aren't we seeing the full thing yet? Because revolutions in politics are not like revolutions in economics. In economics, the thing that breaks a paradigm is usually the thing that replaces the paradigm. So when the typewriter was replaced by, the paradigm of the typewriter was destroyed by the word processing computer. And it was the word processing computer that became the new paradigm. In politics, it's a two-step dance. In the French Revolution, had the Girondists and the more moderate revolutionaries who really were worried about liberté and égalité. And then you had the second wave, which the Great Terror was really against the ones who led the first wave, which was Robespierre and Marat against the others. So the Jacobins took over from the others. It's a two-step process. When you look at history, Russia, you had Kerensky in the February Revolution, and then you had the October Revolution with Lenin. In Iran, you had Shapur Bakhtiar took over from the Shah, and then you had Khomeini take over from Shapur Bakhtiar. In Syria, this is the process. It's a two-step revolution. We have not seen the full essence of what will emerge, but I can look and see already that the powers underneath the surface are the most ghastly and dangerous ones there. Now, in the long run, this is an interesting thing, is the Turks have created this Frankenstein monster, but like a Frankenstein monster, it can be uncontrollable. The Turks want to reestablish an Islamic caliphate under Sultan Erdogan. And yet they have now triggered the Umayyad Caliphate. And there's room for one caliphate in this saloon. So at the end of the day, this is a fissure. Remember, when Islamists, or really Arab nationalists, the whole panoply, have problems among themselves, they overcome their internal fratricidal fight by externalizing it on Israel, on Zionism, on the West. So the first phase of this will be to overcome this. They will try to avoid this inherent ripping apart by externalizing it on Israel. So Israel's headed for a very dangerous period coming and has to prepare strategically for that. But the strategic elements underneath, if Israel racks up victories against this new coalition emerging of Sultan Erdogan, Caliph al-Jolani, if the fratricidal fissures break into fratricidal murder and warfare when frustration sets in and success doesn't follow. Success is so utterly necessary for these coalitions of people who hate each other to continue to focus externally. If they are forced in on themselves, they implode. So that's essentially the long run necessity of Israel. It has to force an implosion of this.
So most of the world has absolutely fallen for Mohammad al-Jolani or Ahmad Sharia's charm offensive. I think it's really important to bear in mind that he said first Damascus, then Jerusalem. And, he does get a tremendous amount of backing from Turkey. And what we fail to understand is that since October 7th, there's been almost no US or global pressure on Turkey. Do you think that the US could pressure Ankara into some kind of a political pivot, or is it absolutely not in the cards because of Erdogan's desire to reestablish an Ottoman caliphate?
I think we can't change Erdogan, and we can't change Jolani, and we can't change the people who surround Jolani, and we can't change the people that surround Erdogan now. So the only real way to do it is impose strategic pressure on them, and then force these internal fissures to erupt in frustration. Now, what is Jolani's strategy right now, and Iran or Turkey's strategy? It's what Turkey always does: is they don't fight the war directly. They let others do the battle, and then they swoop in the vacuum. That's what they did in Syria with HTS now, but it's also what they did when America, and unfortunately used Iran instead of do it all itself, and the Kurds, when America defeated ISIS a decade ago, or less than a decade ago, under the first years of the Trump administration, when we obliterated ISIS. The Turks just sat by. They didn't do anything. They let ISIS fighters go in and out. They actually liberated some jails and said they will take care of those prisoners, but they repackaged the ISIS terrorists and they sent them to Libya and other places to haunt everybody else elsewhere, as well as come back on them. And so forth. And they used them also for Central Asia and against others there. So the Turks definitely want right now to see to swoop in, but they have a real problem: is that they don't control this democratic area of northeast Syria, which is the Danes area, which is the Kurds, the Yazidis, the Syriac churches, Chaldeans, and stuff like that. And it had American support until now, and hopefully it will continue. And they have a reasonable shot of maintaining themselves. And of course, Turkey sees that as a major strategic issue, that until they consolidate their control of Syria, this is a potential vulnerable flank. The second thing is to control the Turkish Islamists with the Alawites. The Alawites are not just the enemy of Sunnis, but particularly of Turkmens. And the Turkmens are swooping down from the Hatay province. So there's an awful lot of bloodshed there. And then also to consolidate against the Christians and to make the Christians in Syria realize they are dhimmis now. So, and not to threaten. And then finally, they have this headache with the Druze, the 700,000 Druze and Jebel Druze and the pockets of Druze near Israel's border. All these minorities know what they're dealing with. They're not Western elites. So they actually deal with reality, unlike Western elites. And the reality they know is that they're headed for dark times. Unless they extract themselves from the control of the central Syrian government, they are in deep, if not existential, threat. Kurds, Yazidis know that this could be the end of them. Druze know it will be decades of Gehenna, of hell, and so forth. So they're running, and the Druze, some of them find want to be part of Israel, and so forth. But what is the HTS in Turkey up to? They know, first of all, they have to consolidate the Kurdish area. That will break the back of the threat to the government and the viability, essentially, of splitting Syria to pieces. And the second thing is, look at al-Jolani. First of all, al-Jolani's name means Golan. It's not his name. He took that name, which means that tells you what he's aiming for, the Golan, number one. Number two, his name's Shara. Like Farouk Ashara, he's actually a relative of the same family of Farouk Ashara, who's the foreign minister of the Ba'athist Syrian regime, which shows you how fluid these identities are. The second thing that's important is he was al-Qaeda Iraq under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. The core of Zarqawi's support were urban Arabs in Western Iraq and in Jordan. That's where they got their support. Why? Zarqawi is nothing more, also not the guy's original name. Zarqawi comes from Zarqa. Where is Zarqa? It's not in Iraq, it's in Jordan. So the following of al-Qaeda Iraq was anchored in northern Jordan. And nobody knows that better than HTS and al-Jolani, etc. So their immediate target is first to shut down the Kurds. HTS is trying to put forward a moderate face. Oh, just join the government. We'll have a nice coalition, blah, blah, blah. And the Turks are the hammer. It's a good cop, bad cop game. And then the next focal point is northern Jordan. And then once you have northern Jordan, then you arc back to the Palestinians and Jerusalem.
Okay, I find this, and I'm sure everybody listening finds it morally reprehensible. After all, the Kurds really were on the forefront of our fight against ISIS, and so many Kurds died for us. I know right now we have about 2,000 US troops around the Kurdish areas. Do you think that under Trump, these troops will remain and the Kurds might get some protection from the United States?
Yeah, I think I know the sentiment of the incoming president is we've done enough in the Middle East. We're tired. Now, for those who, support Israel and the Abraham Accords and things like that, it is not a disengagement. It is not isolationism. There are isolationist elements in the conservative movement, some of which do have, and we have to be honest about this, some of them have anti-Semitic overlays. I think when you get to people like Massey and you get to people like, I mean, sad to say because he's such a great talent, but people like Tucker Carlson and so forth have unfortunately begun to cross the line. But by and large, that's not where the bulk of the Republican movement is. They still believe in an America that is a global power, that is strong, but that they don't want to keep investing on behalf of others who aren't willing to fight in endless wars, so to speak. So for them, it actually translates into increased support for our allies like Israel. because Israeli victory and Israeli power is the mechanism by which America needs to invest less in the region. The irony of all these people who intervened over the last decades to restrain Israel to improve our position in the region, they got it upside down. Israeli victory and Israeli power allows us to disengage from the region because their enemies are our enemies. And when their enemies are defeated and weak, they start imploding and so forth, it allows us to invest less in the region. So I think this administration, incoming administration, gets that. How much it gets it about the others, I think it's a learning process. I think they will find. Well, I think they have a skepticism toward Turkey. I know there's a lot of people out there who think that Erdogan will be pull the wool over President Trump's eyes and so forth. There's so many people in this administration. I think also the president himself, who knows who they're dealing with Turkey. And they may not fully appreciate all the ideological trends and movements and tectonics we're talking about here, but I think reality will set in. And so I do think that we will see the United States not with direct, huge, boots on the ground military intervention, but with continued support of the Danes area, which is a critical strategic element. And of course, it all becomes a lot easier, going back to the very first thing we talked about, if Iran is taken out of the picture. So now Iran is not only an urgent matter because you can't turn your back on a cobra that can go nuclear venom, whatever analogy we want to mix here terribly. But at any rate, it's not only because Iran is so dangerous, but we kind of, like we needed Germany at the end of World War II to reintegrate into Western defense against the Soviets. We need a post-Ayatollah Iran to help us out in the region, not in an imperial way. Obviously, we've had enough of the imperial side of that, but we need them to help us with Iraq, stabilize Iraq, and then use that as a foundation for stabilizing the Danes area. It really helps a lot, and it will convince the UAE and Saudi Arabia to focus on who is their real enemy, which is this neo-Umayyad caliphate bearing down from the north. And then all of a sudden you have possibilities here.
So, speaking about a post-nuclear Iran, there have been several attempts from the Iranians on either President-elect Donald Trump's life, or on Mike Pompeo's life or John Bolton's life. Do you think that the incoming administration will provide Israel with what it needs to do its job, taking out the Iranian nuclear program?
Yeah, I think what really emerged in this war over the last 16 months, 15, 16 months, is that Israel has the power, but it doesn't have all the resources it needed to fight. I mean, its troops are definitely tired, largely also because of these ground wars that they had to have in Gaza. Also, I believe that they're tired because they fought a long war that was unnecessary. Unnecessary because I think this administration, the Biden administration, did not let them win. I think this war could have been over within 2-3 months in Gaza, and Israel could have reduced vastly its footprint in Gaza under having taken it, held the territory, and established military control over all of Gaza. And I think it was in a position to do that, but two things got in the way, or really three things. One was the American administration under Biden was simply unwilling to let Israel win. It was terrified of essentially reversing Oslo in Gaza. They didn't want the Israelis to say, that failed, we have to reoccupy. And where it was obvious that was the only military strategy possible. The second thing is you had an Israeli military which had institutionally convinced itself of a new ethos over the last 20, 30 years. So its top-level military structure, through doctrine and culture, essentially absorbed this idea that we're never going back to conquer territory. We're never taking territory. We have to find the Arab that we work with to control our own border, and they control beyond that border to help us maintain our border. So we're always looking for the Palestinian moderate who will govern instead and allow us not to have to retake territory. On top of it all, the strategic concepts had social and cultural impacts in Israel. For example, if you don't believe in taking territory, then the ground forces become sort of the devalued aspect of Israeli military. And you see that in budgets, arming, and supply. They really became suffocated and starved, which is a big factor on October 7th. The second thing is you saw societal things, which is you get in, I mean, this is a whole not really for this, but the internal societal upheaval in Israel, where the old elites of Israel are losing control of the popular society, and they're retreating into core institutions to maintain their power, whether it's education, the courts, and the military. And how do you maintain the military? The threat is Iran. Therefore, who deals with Iran? It's the Air Force and intelligence and Mossad. So all the resources and all the places that the elites put their kids in, because it set their careers, and said, we still own Zionism because we're the ones who are paying the price to defend it. We're in the Air Force. So the ground forces were filled with all these people who they devalued, and they said, you don't really own Zionism, whether they're religious nationalists, etc. Of course, the war's changed all that, because who's been fighting and dying? It's those elements of society that were devalued. So, and they're going to come after the war, and they say, we do own Zionism also. You have to share. Anyway, that's a whole tangent. Don't want to go off on that. Bottom line is the Israeli military itself had a culture of non-acquisition of territory by force. We saw that in Lebanon. They should have immediately screamed up to the Litani River after the Operation Grim Beeper and so forth. They should have gone hard. We can argue whether or not they should have taken that 10-day pause for the hostages. But after that, they should have gone with full force to finish the job immediately all the way, which could have been done by New Year's. So this exhaustion of the Israeli military is really a function of the way the war was fought. The depletion of resources was how that happened. The United States would choke the Israeli army to force them to slow down. And the second thing was the alliance between the Americans and the elite of the IDF. So that then created that unholy structure that delivered a long, indecisive war in Gaza. And frankly, will be a two-part war in Lebanon because Hezbollah is not dead yet. So Israel has the power to be a regional power. It just needs an America that doesn't stand in its way and gives it the tools. And I think this administration, even if it does nothing else, won't stop the weapons flowing to Israel and won't tie both of Israel's hands behind their back, which means Israeli power becomes the factor.
We still have a few more minutes, so let's discuss Egypt, the second
Right.
recipient of U.S. military aid. It gets about $1.2 billion in direct military assistance and $1.5 billion overall from various agencies. And Cairo, you wrote, quote, put its finger to the wind and is slowly drifting towards the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt is being very coy, and it seems to be playing both sides. Could you kind of enlarge upon that and explain Egypt's position here?
Right. Well, first of all, one has to just very quickly about Hamas. One thinks Hamas is on the ropes and finished because its patron, Iran, is dead. And I think Hamas is also a Rorschach test for regional politics. It's a litmus test. The Palestinians are always a reflection of regional politics. So Hamas is not dead. It's just shifting to being a Turkish organization, a Muslim, back to its core of being a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood organization, and it's feeling energy, the same energy that led the terrorists in New Orleans to do what he did. You feel the energy of the Muslim Brotherhood under the Syrian victory, deluding themselves that it wasn't Israeli power, but Allah and the favor that the true purist Islam under this Salafi spirit has won and is winning and is now sweeping. So that's why I don't believe Hamas is really done yet and going to give up the hostages, because they're now seeing the next big horse riding onto the scene, and they're beginning to shift to attach their cart to that. So here's Egypt with its finger in the wind. It saw that for the last 3 years or so. So it began to shift to appeasing that. The problem that Egypt has is that it's not something that's easily appeased. I think in December, they still imagined maybe they could cut a deal with Erdogan. But what they didn't expect is Erdogan to so aggressively and so fast turn to an imperial project in Libya and North Africa, and turn to an imperial project in the Horn of Africa, which begins to encircle Egypt. So they're terrified. The second thing I think Egypt didn't expect was the implosion of Russia. We forget the Israelis also blew the Russians in the Middle East out of the water by destroying the Syrian regime. And again, I emphasize it's Israel and Israeli power. One has to remember where the real power is versus the perception of power. The region operates on perception, but the real power is what in the end wins or dominates. The Israelis were the real power that destroyed Syrian regime. The Russians essentially are devastated by that, and that destroys their strategic position not only in Syria, but in North Africa, because that was a major logistics hub. And through that, also in the Sahel region, the below the coastline region of the Sahara and North Africa, which was where the Wagner forces were, and they were making a huge play, the Russians in that area. And the Egyptians were playing with their finger in the wind, appeasing Turkey, but increasingly relying on Russia. Now, for Israel, that was already a problem, because when you look at the Abraham Accords, the peace of the Abraham Accords was because American power was becoming AWOL and fickle under the Obama administration, and those countries looked around and said, "Who will protect us?" And Israeli power was out there, so they aligned with Israel. So they were directly related to Israeli power, and that now is reinforced. Egypt, on the other hand, if you look back to how the peace emerged in Egypt, it was not that dynamic. I'm a fan of Sadat, but what his real strategic vision was, he understood, quite to his credit, that the Soviet bloc was going to fall, that the Soviet bloc cannot compete with the West, which is a great thing to see in 74, 75, when we were in Vietnam retreating and looked horribly defeated. But he still understood, no, the West will come back and win. So for him, the strong horse was the West. And he understood there was a down payment that had to be made to aligning with the West, and that was peace with Israel. Well, if the Egyptians now see the West as declining to Egypt, and they have over the last 5 years, to Chinese economic power, to Russian strategic power, to Iranian power in the region, and now to the rising Muslim Brotherhood, with their finger in the wind, America is number 5 in priorities of appeasing or to be on good terms with. And the down payment that was required to stay on good terms with America, which is peace with Israel, is valueless. I don't know if they want to go to war right now, but the peace is valueless. So one has to look at Egypt turning now strategically to devaluing peace with Israel. And it's got whiplash trying to navigate these things, but in the end, I think underneath, they have no real choice ultimately but to appease the Turks, and that is going to be dangerous.
So I have so many more questions, but I'll just ask you one more and then we'll wrap this up because I know you have to go to the Pentagon. But if you were sitting in Israel's cabinet today, or actually in the US administration today, how might you advise the prime minister or the president?
Okay, well, first of all, Israel needs a national security strategy. It really hasn't had an effective one since the early 50s. And the United States has not had one since the late 90s. I mean, late 80s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we had this thing called NSC 68, which really governed our Cold War outlook, and it still was relevant 40 years later, which is how solid it was. Israel also had effective strategy that was set in roughly the same period, early 50s. But unfortunately, I think Oslo erased so much of the imagery that Israel had internalized strategically. And with it, Israel's strategic position is flailing now, as is the United States. So the first thing I would do if I were Israel, if I were king in Israel, is to work out a strategy that does not tie itself to a single country. There is no strategy against Iran. There is no strategy against rising Neo-Ottoman Caliphate, Sultanate, or the Neo-Umayyad Caliphate. There has to be an Israeli strategy that emerges from its own societal structure, its power, its organization, its geography, and it should be designed to deal with any combination of threats that emerge over the next 50 to 100 years. Exactly the same parameters and metrics that were used in 48 to 52 to set American and Israeli strategies by each of those governments at the time. They didn't think only of the Soviet Union. They thought more broadly. America, ever since its foundation, was thinking more broadly. It never knew who the enemy ultimately would be. So it set a strategy to deal with any enemy. So Israel has to think that. So even if it makes peace tomorrow with Jolani, and let's say Jolani does turn out to be Thomas Jefferson with the kafia, um, you know, that doesn't mean in 50 years they're dealing with Thomas Jefferson with the kafia. So giving up territory is a permanent act. Strategic realities shift. So Israel has to create a geographic, strategic, societal reality that weathers any combination of events in the future and stop thinking about the current threat, but the threats more broadly. Is this territory essential for Israel's defense against anybody who threatens? And is the way Israel organizes its military amenable to that? Just for example, same thing as the United States in our Constitution. Israel is a democracy and it is small, which means it will rely on mobilization. People don't have a military ethic. They don't want to. They don't strive. The whole society is not militarized. Most people want to go about doing their own business. They need to defend their country. They go to the reserves. They show up. They go home. The business of Israelis is to mind their own business, just like the business of the Americans is to mind their own business. But sometimes we're attacked, so we have to mobilize. So we rely on mobilization because of that. The second thing is because of the smallness of it, Israel needs to mobilize far beyond what is a sustainable structure. It can't just mobilize 700,000 troops and leave them there for 4 years. So it needs geography and technology, but mostly geography, to be a buffer zone so that when it's attacked, it has the time to mobilize. So Israel has to imagine its geography in terms of those conditions and then start thinking about threats and directions of threats. But first and foremost, it's a mobilization society that will have a smallish standing army with limited power that needs to mobilize when attacked and therefore needs buffer zones. And technology is not a buffer zone. We found that out on October 7th. Geography is a buffer zone. The United States' buffer zone, if people ask, it's the oceans, which is why our Constitution says maintain a navy. And it's in the Constitution. Must maintain a navy, but raise an army. The army is what you mobilize when you're attacked. The navy is your buffer linked to the sea. Israel has to have a similar concept. Linked its standing army, maintain standing army to specific geography, and then defend itself on that while it mobilizes when attacked.
Brilliant, brilliant. I loved what you said about giving up territory is permanent, but Middle Eastern reality changes, and Israel really has to maintain defensible borders in order to be able to be the superpower that it is right now. I mean, when you look at the geography of the world, you see how tiny Israel is, but Israel is really fighting all of our battles. I can't thank you enough, David Wormser. Please support him in his work at the Mazag Center in Jerusalem or the Center for Security Policy. And of course, we need your support in the Endowment for Middle East. Truth, we're on Capitol Hill almost every day talking to policymakers or their staffers to provide accurate facts and analysis about these incredibly critical policy decisions regarding the Middle East. And our efforts have been successful. So we need your support at amenonline.org, and the Center for Security Policy.org also is a wonderful organization that provides brilliant analysts such as David Wormser with the salary that he needs. So thank you very, very much, David. It's always a pleasure.
It's an honor.
So
It's an
much
honor.
more
It's
I'd
an honor.
like to discuss with you. We'll have you back.
I
Thank you so
love being with you. Yeah.